This is not a story for the faint-hearted. What you are about to witness is based on real documented events. Incidents so disturbing that even the Catholic Church sealed many of its records for decades. This is not a Hollywood movie. This is the story that inspired The Exorcist, one of the scariest films ever made. Asterisk if you scare easily, if you are under 16, or if you believe some doors are better left unopened. We advise you to stop watching now. But if you choose to continue, remember this: every word, every scream, and every detail in this documentary is drawn from real-life testimonies, priest diaries, and official reports. The question is, can you handle the truth? Part 1, The Roland Doe Case 1949. It was the winter of 1949 in Cottage City, Maryland, a small quiet town where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Snow lined the rooftops of the modest houses, and the wind carried a bitter chill that forced everyone indoors before nightfall. In one of these homes lived a boy named Roland Doe, a 13-year-old only child with a shy demeanor and an unshakable bond with his Aunt Harriet. He was the kind of boy who preferred to read books in silence rather than play outside with other children. People who knew him described him as polite, reserved, and overly dependent on the adults around him. But the closest person in Roland's life was Harriet, an eccentric woman fascinated by spiritualism. She often spoke of the spirit world as if it were right beside them, invisible but always present. She owned a Ouija board, something Roland thought of as a mysterious toy, a way to talk to people who had died. Harriet would spend hours showing him how to use it, sliding the planchette gently across the board's letters and smiling when it appeared to spell out messages. Then, without warning, Harriet fell gravely ill. Her death came quickly and left Roland heartbroken. The boy, who was already quiet, became almost completely withdrawn. He stopped speaking to neighbors, stayed in his room for hours, and clutched Harriet's Ouija board like a sacred relic. His parents tried to comfort him, but they could not fill the void she had left behind. That was when the first strange noises began. At night, the family would hear scratching coming from the walls of Roland's bedroom. At first, they dismissed it as mice. They called an exterminator who inspected the entire house. But there were no droppings, no chew marks, nothing. Still, the noises continued. Soon it was more than scratching. They began to hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving up and down the hallway outside Roland's room. One night, his mother swore she heard the footsteps stop at his bedroom door, then the sound of fingernails dragging slowly across the wood. When she opened the door, Roland was asleep, and there was nothing there. The boy's behavior began to change. He was seen sitting alone in his room, the Ouija board laid out in front of him. When his mother asked who he was talking to, he simply said, "Aunt Harriet." She snatched the board away, but Roland grew furious. He screamed at her with a rage that seemed completely unlike him. As the days passed, the sounds in the house grew louder and more violent. Furniture was found moved in the morning. Roland's bed shook at night as if invisible hands were lifting it. Sometimes it would slide several inches across the floor while he was lying on it. One night, Roland's mother heard him cry out. When she ran into his room, she saw deep red scratches across his chest and arms. They were fresh, the skin still bleeding. She cleaned them as best she could, but by morning more scratches had appeared. The scratches seemed to form letters, crude but unmistakable. One night the word Louis appeared carved across his stomach. His mother believed it meant St. Louis, where their extended family lived. She told her husband they needed to leave Cottage City immediately and take Roland there, hoping a change in environment might end whatever was tormenting him. Before they could leave, the family sought help from their Lutheran pastor. He came to their home, carrying his Bible and a solemn expression. He prayed over Roland for 2 nights, but during the second night, Roland's behavior escalated beyond anything they had seen before. His eyes rolled back in his head, his voice deepened, and he began to speak in a language the pastor did not understand. The pastor would later write in his report that the boy had tried to attack him, with a strength number 13-year-olds should possess. Shaken, the pastor told the parents, "This is beyond me. You need to seek the Catholics. They know how to deal with this." The family packed their belongings and traveled to St. Louis to stay with relatives. It was there that Roland's parents approached the Catholic Church for help. They met with Father Hughes, a young priest who listened carefully to their story. At first, he was skeptical, but when he visited the house and saw the boy himself, his doubts faded. Roland was sitting in bed, staring at the ceiling, muttering words no one recognized. The bed suddenly trembled under him without any visible cause. Father Hughes agreed to perform an exorcism, but church protocol required permission from the archbishop. After reviewing the pastor's reports and speaking with Roland's parents, permission was granted. The exorcism was conducted in a hospital room where Roland could be restrained and observed. The boy was strapped to the bed with leather bindings. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the priest reciting the ancient Latin prayers. For the first hour, Roland writhed and screamed, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. Then, as Father Hughes placed a crucifix on the boy's chest, Roland broke free of one of the straps. He reached under the bed, ripped a spring from the mattress frame, and slashed it across the priest's arm. Blood poured down Hughes' sleeve as he stumbled back. He required over 100 stitches. The exorcism was abruptly halted and Roland was sent back home, but the disturbances only intensified. Relatives who stayed in the house reported objects flying across rooms. Knocking sounds came from inside the walls. Roland would sometimes wake up screaming, his body convulsing. Other times he would stare blankly into space for hours, whispering to someone only he could see. The family was desperate. They contacted the church again, and this time 2 Jesuit priests were assigned, Father William Baudouin, an experienced and calm man, and Father Walter Halloran, a younger assistant. The priests visited the house and immediately sensed something was wrong. As they prayed over Roland, the boy's body arched in an unnatural way, his back forming a perfect curve as if pulled by invisible strings. Words appeared on his skin again, this time more violently, as though carved by unseen claws. He hissed at the priests and screamed when they held up a crucifix. Father Baudouin contacted the archbishop for formal permission to begin a series of exorcisms. Permission was granted. The exorcisms were conducted nightly, often lasting several hours. Each session was a battle. Roland would shout blasphemies, sometimes in Latin, a language he had never learned. His voice would shift from high-pitched screams to guttural growls that did not sound human. Furniture in the room would shake violently. At one point, witnesses claimed the entire bed lifted off the floor. The priests documented everything in a diary, describing how words like hell and evil would appear on Roland's chest and legs, sometimes bleeding. Father Halloran, the younger priest, was often tasked with holding Roland down while Father Baudouin continued the prayers. The boy's strength was extraordinary. Halloran later said, "It was like trying to hold down a grown man in the peak of rage. He would throw us across the room as if we weighed nothing." This went on for almost 30 nights. The priests were exhausted. Roland would sometimes collapse into a deep sleep after the sessions, only to wake hours later with the same violent energy. The priests began to fear that they were losing the battle. Then came April 18, 1949. On this night, Roland was more aggressive than ever. He screamed profanities, spit at the priests, and fought with every ounce of his strength. Father Baudouin, clutching his crucifix, called upon Saint Michael the Archangel, the defender of heaven. He prayed aloud, "Saint Michael, cast Satan and all his evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls back into hell." Roland let out a scream so loud it echoed through the house. His body thrashed violently, then went completely still. The room fell silent. The temperature, which had dropped unbearably cold during the session, suddenly returned to normal. Roland opened his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, they looked clear. He whispered softly, "He is gone." The priest loosened his restraints. Roland sat up, exhausted but calm. He showed no sign of the violent energy that had consumed him for months. The exorcism was over. The Catholic Church sealed the records of the case. Father Halloran and Father Baudouin returned to their duties but would never forget what they had witnessed. Halloran, interviewed many years later, admitted, "I can't explain what I saw." But it was not human. Roland grew up quietly, never speaking of what had happened. He lived a normal life, but those who knew the story believed he was marked forever. This was the case that would later inspire the book and the film The Exorcist. But as terrifying as Roland Doe's story was, it was only the beginning. There are hundreds of similar exorcisms documented around the world, many far darker than this one. And in the next part, we will go behind the sealed doors of the Vatican itself to uncover the secrets of the Church's real exorcists. Part 2, the Vatican's real exorcists and their secrets. Vatican City, the smallest independent state in the world, is surrounded by towering stone walls that have stood for centuries, holding secrets that few outside its gates will ever know. On the surface, it looks serene. Pilgrims gather in St. Peter's Square, gazing up at the great basilica's dome as the bells ring across Rome. But deep beneath this holy city, in private chambers far from public view, there are files, archives, and rituals that have existed for centuries. They belong to a group of men trained in one of the Church's oldest and most controversial practices, exorcism. The Catholic Church has always maintained that the devil is real, that he is active in the world, and that he seeks to possess and destroy. But in the modern era, as science has advanced and society has grown skeptical of anything supernatural, the Church has become quieter about exorcisms. Many believe they are a relic of medieval superstition, but inside the Vatican's walls, the Church has never stopped performing them. In fact, it has an entire office dedicated to training priests to fight what it calls pure evil. When Roland Doe's case shook America in 1949, Vatican officials took notice. Though the Church did not publicly confirm the details, the priests involved submitted their diaries and reports directly to the Vatican archives. Those records are still there, locked away in a section of the Vatican library that requires special permission to enter. The Vatican learned from Roland's case, just as it had learned from thousands before. It reaffirmed their belief that exorcists must be better trained, better prepared, and fully protected spiritually before entering battle with demonic forces. To understand how deep the Vatican's involvement goes, one must step into the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the office that for centuries handled matters of heresy and the supernatural. Here, in a wing of the Apostolic Palace, priests are chosen for their devotion, their mental discipline, and their ability to endure things that would terrify most people. They are taught not only the ancient prayers of exorcism, but also how to recognize when a person is truly possessed and when the problem may be psychological. Because the Church knows the difference can be life or death. A Vatican-trained exorcist does not begin his work lightly. The process starts with months, sometimes years, of observation. Priests study the person in question, speaking with their families, their doctors, and even psychiatrists. They look for signs that defy explanation: levitation, sudden knowledge of languages never studied, abnormal strength, or an aversion to sacred objects. They test the individual quietly, often without them realizing, holding a blessed crucifix or sprinkling holy water to see how they react. Father Gabriel Amorth was one of the Vatican's most famous exorcists. He began his work in the 1980s, and would later claim to have performed over 50,000 exorcisms. Amherst described his first training in Rome as both humbling and terrifying. He was brought into a small chapel at the Pontifical University of Regina Apostolorum, where senior exorcists demonstrated the rite. He recalled hearing a woman's voice suddenly deepen into a guttural growl as the prayers began, the air growing heavy and cold. "It was as if the devil was staring directly at me," he later said. "In that moment, I understood this was not symbolic. This was real." The Vatican runs an official exorcism course at this university, attended by priests from all over the world. They study not only theology but also human psychology, because the Church insists that mental illness must be ruled out before exorcism is even considered. The priests are taught to work with doctors, not against them. But they are also told that there are things medicine cannot explain. They are shown recordings of past exorcisms, cases where individuals displayed superhuman strength, where their voices changed, where they revealed secrets about the priest's present secrets they could never have known. One such case was kept in a secure room for training purposes. The video showed a young man restrained in a hospital bed in Italy. As the prayers intensified, he began to scream, his voice echoing unnaturally. At one point, his body lifted several inches off the bed, though his hands and feet were bound. In the background of the recording, a crucifix suddenly snapped off the wall. The priests watching the tape were silent, some gripping their rosaries tighter. They were reminded that this work was not just dangerous to the body, but to the soul. The Vatican also instructs exorcists on how to spiritually protect themselves. Before every session, they go to confession and receive the Eucharist. They fast, they pray, and they ask for the intercession of saints, because they believe that when a priest steps into the room of a possessed person, he is not only confronting the demon in that person, but also making himself a target. Demons, they are taught, will try to break the exorcist's faith. They will mock him, accuse him, and bring up his darkest sins. Father Amorth often spoke of this. He remembered a case in which the demon inside a young girl shouted out his private sins from decades earlier, things he had confessed but never told another living soul. He said it was like having his soul ripped open. "But I held my crucifix," he recalled, "and I reminded myself that Christ had already forgiven me. That was the only way to stand firm." While the Vatican is clear that exorcism is a last resort, it quietly acknowledges that the number of requests for exorcism has grown in recent years. Some officials believe this is because of the rise in occult practices, others because of the increased desperation in a world that has become more secular and uncertain. Whatever the reason, the Church has responded by training more priests than ever before. But these priests rarely speak publicly about their work. They do not want fame, and they do not want the cases sensationalized. They keep detailed records of every session, which are then sent to Rome and stored in the Vatican's archives. These records contain descriptions that are chilling to read: children speaking in the voices of dead relatives, elderly women contorting their bodies in impossible ways, entire rooms suddenly filling with a stench of decay when the prayers begin. There are priests who cannot complete their training. Some break down emotionally after witnessing their first exorcism. Others begin to suffer disturbing dreams, hearing voices at night. The Vatican provides them with counseling and spiritual care, but it is understood that not everyone is called to this battle. Those who do continue are considered among the most spiritually resilient in the Church. One senior Vatican official once said privately, "We are soldiers in a war most people do not even know exists, and the enemy is ancient, cunning, and relentless." That is why the Vatican continues to invest in this work, even though the world outside its walls may scoff. They believe that every exorcism is not just about saving a single person, but about reclaiming ground from an evil that seeks to spread. What the public sees is only the surface. a pope blessing the crowd, a priest saying mass, a nun teaching school children. But behind closed doors, there are priests who spend their entire lives confronting darkness face to face. They return home from an exorcism drained, sometimes shaken, but they continue because they believe they are called to do so. These Vatican-trained exorcists rarely speak about the moments when they felt fear grip them so tightly they could hardly breathe, or the times they thought they might not make it out alive. But those who do admit it will tell you one thing. The most dangerous part of an exorcism is not what happens in the room. It is what follows. Because the demon, if cast out, may seek revenge. It may come after the exorcist, his family, or anyone it can harm. This is why Vatican exorcists live lives of strict prayer and discipline. They surround themselves with holy objects, they maintain confession, and they avoid situations that could make them spiritually vulnerable. And yet, even with all this preparation, there are stories of exorcists who fell ill or died unexpectedly after a particularly violent case. The Vatican does not confirm these stories, but those who work in this ministry believe them. The world outside may never fully understand the reality of what goes on behind the Vatican's doors, but the priests who serve there understand the stakes. They know that each time they answer a call for help, they are stepping into a battlefield that stretches beyond the physical world. They believe they are defending souls from forces that seek to destroy them, and they know that this work will never end. What you have heard is only a glimpse into the Vatican's exorcism ministry. There are stories locked away in the archives that are far more disturbing, cases that have been suppressed to protect those involved. But in the next part, we will open those files. We will travel back through centuries of history, to the witch trials of medieval Europe, to the rituals of ancient religions, and to the forgotten villages where exorcisms are still performed in secret. Part 3. The history of exorcisms around the world. Since the beginning of recorded history, human beings have believed in forces they could not see. Every ancient civilization, no matter how far apart or isolated, developed a belief that unseen entities could inhabit the living, bringing with them suffering, madness, and death. These spirits were called by many names: demons, jinn, evil winds, restless souls, but the fear they inspired was the same. From the temples of Mesopotamia to the forests of Africa, people created rituals meant to drive these forces away, and these rituals, though they changed in language and form, are what we now call exorcisms. Thousands of years ago, in the cradle of civilization, priests in Mesopotamia would carve protective incantations onto clay tablets. When someone was thought to be possessed, they believed a malevolent spirit had entered their body. The priests would recite long prayers to their gods, calling on them to expel the evil presence. They would burn herbs that filled the room with choking smoke, believing the spirit would be forced out by the fumes. Sometimes they would craft small figurines of the possessing spirit and destroy them violently, symbolically breaking its hold over the victim. These early exorcisms were as much about fear as they were about faith. To the people of Mesopotamia, the unseen world was closer than the air they breathed. In ancient Egypt, priests known as Heka practitioners carried out rituals to banish evil entities. Egyptian religion believed in a balance between order, called Mat, and chaos, called Isfet. Possession was seen as a form of chaos. The afflicted person would be brought into a temple, laid on the floor, and surrounded by protective hieroglyphs drawn in chalk. The priests would recite spells from the Book of the Dead or other sacred texts, demanding that the spirit identify itself. They would place protective amulets around the victim's neck, believing these objects carried the power of the gods. Similar practices existed in ancient Greece and Rome. There, healers believed that possession could be caused by angry spirits or even the gods themselves. Physicians like Hippocrates often tried to treat possession as a medical problem, using herbs or purgatives, but others turned to the temple. Victims were sometimes taken to oracles who would enter a trance and speak to the possessing entity. In some cases, the afflicted were made to drink bitter potions while priests shouted prayers over them, attempting to drive the spirit out through sickness. Far from the Mediterranean world, shamans in Siberia and other nomadic tribes also developed their own methods. They believed that spirits clung to the soul like parasites. Shamans would enter a trance by beating drums and chanting for hours, their voices growing hoarse and raw. They would call on their ancestors or animal spirits for help, sometimes performing dangerous acts like piercing their own skin with needles to prove their strength. In some tribes, it was believed that the shamaness spirit would leave his body and fight the demon in the other world, dragging it away from the victim. In Africa, exorcism rituals varied across hundreds of cultures but shared a belief in community participation. Entire villages might gather when someone was believed to be possessed. Drums would pound, feet stamping the earth as the crowd chanted. The afflicted person was often placed in the center, their body shaking and convulsing as the community sang songs meant to call on ancestral spirits to intervene. These rituals could last all night with no breaks until the victim collapsed from exhaustion. In the Middle East, long before Islam, tribes believed in jinn-powerful unseen entities capable of possessing humans. Exorcists would recite poetry or prayers, sometimes using fire to threaten the jinn. When Islam spread across the region, it brought its own exorcism traditions. Verses from the Quran were recited over the possessed, and holy water or oils were applied to their bodies. Some accounts describe the jinn speaking through the victim in strange voices, begging for mercy as the words of the Quran were read aloud. In India, Hindu priests carried out exorcisms using mantra-sacred chants believed to hold divine energy. Victims were often brought to temples where bells rang continuously, their vibrations meant to drive the spirit away. Priests would sprinkle Ganges water on the person, draw protective symbols on their skin, and burn incense so thick the air became suffocating. It was believed the smoke would make the spirit uncomfortable and force it to leave. In some villages, the exorcist would take on the persona of a fierce deity, shouting threats at the demon, promising to destroy it if it did not depart. In medieval Europe, the rise of Christianity changed exorcism rituals profoundly. Priests now performed the rite using the authority of Christ's name. The possessed person would be restrained, as the ritual could become violent. The priest would hold a crucifix above them and read passages from the Bible. Latin became the language of exorcism, and many believed the demon could not stand to hear the holy words. Churches became the setting for many of these rituals, but some were done in isolated monasteries, far from the public eye. The medieval period also brought fear and superstition to new heights. People believed that possession could be contagious, that merely being near the afflicted could draw evil to oneself. Entire towns could turn against the family if someone showed signs of possession, believing they were cursed. Some exorcisms were performed publicly, with crowds watching as priests shouted over the screams of the victim. There are records of exorcists using physical pain whipping, burning with holy oil, believing it would drive the demon out. The witch trials of Europe and America added another layer of terror. Many accused of witchcraft were believed to be possessed or in league with demons. Priests would attempt exorcisms on the accused, demanding confessions. These were brutal times when superstition often led to death. People believed they were fighting an invisible enemy, and the church encouraged this fear as a way to maintain control. In Asia, Buddhist monks developed their own exorcism traditions. In Tibet, monks used powerful horns and cymbals during ceremonies, believing the noise would confuse and terrify the spirit. They would create intricate sand mandalas and destroy them at the climax of the ritual, symbolizing the destruction of the demon's hold. Monks would also engage in days-long chanting, their voices deep and resonant, filling the temples with sound. In the Americas, indigenous tribes performed exorcisms using sacred plants like tobacco or ayahuasca. Shamans believed these plants allowed them to communicate directly with the spirit world. They would blow smoke over the victim, sing songs taught to them by their ancestors, and sometimes enter altered states of consciousness. These experiences were terrifying, but seen as necessary to confront the spirit face to face. As time moved forward, science began to challenge the idea of possession. In the 18th and 19th centuries, doctors increasingly diagnosed mental illness where the church saw demons. But even as psychology advanced, exorcisms never disappeared. They simply went underground. Priests continued to perform the rite quietly, away from the press, while in other parts of the world, traditional healers carried on the old ways. By the 20th century, the Catholic Church had refined its guidelines for exorcism. Priests were told to exhaust all medical explanations before proceeding. But cases like Roland Doe's in 1949 reminded the Church that possession still terrified people. After the release of The Exorcist in 1973, requests for exorcisms surged around the world. Priests from Italy to the Philippines reported more cases than ever, and the Vatican responded by training more exorcists. In some parts of the world, exorcisms remain a community event. In rural Africa and South America, villages still gather to drive out spirits. In India, entire temples are dedicated to freeing people from possession. In Asia, Buddhist and Shinto priests continue centuries-old practices combining prayer, music, and ritual objects. These ceremonies are loud, chaotic, and emotionally charged, but they share the same goal: to protect the living from forces they cannot see. What is striking is how similar these rituals are, even across cultures that never interacted. There is always a recognition of something dark and parasitic, something that takes over a person's will. There is always a belief in sacred words or symbols that can drive it away. And there is always a sense of danger that confronting the spirit puts everyone involved at risk. There are stories from remote villages in Africa where entire families claim to have seen a demon leave, a person in the form of a shadow. There are stories from South America where shamans say they pulled writhing black masses from the victim's body. There are stories from Asia where the possessed spoke in voices of people long dead, describing events no one living could have known. Whether these accounts are true or shaped by fear, they have endured for thousands of years. Every culture has its exorcists, men and women who stand at the edge of the unknown and demand that it retreat. They do this despite the cost to themselves because in every era, people believe that possession is real and that it destroys lives. The history of exorcism is a history of humanity's deepest fears. It shows how far we will go to reclaim control when something unseen threatens us. And even today, in a world of modern medicine and science, these rituals continue. Because for those who believe they have faced the darkness, no scientific explanation will ever be enough. This understanding of humanity's long battle against possession would eventually shape the Catholic Church's approach in the modern world. The Church studied these traditions, recorded their own cases, and created guidelines that continue to this day. But history also carries stories the Church does not want told, accounts so disturbing they remain locked away in archives. Those who have glimpsed them say they reveal just how far the darkness can reach. And as the world grew more connected, so did the stories. Cases from one continent began to resemble those on another. Priests and shamans, monks and medicine men all described the same patterns: a sudden change in the victim's personality, knowledge they could not have known, strength beyond their size, and voices that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. These similarities haunt those who study the phenomenon, because they suggest something far older and more universal than anyone is willing to admit. The battle against possession has never truly ended. It only changes its form, adapting to each culture, each century. The rituals grow more sophisticated, the prayers more precise, but the fear remains the same. There are still nights, even now, when a priest or shaman enters a room, carrying only sacred words and symbols, knowing they are about to face something that may try to destroy them. And they go forward anyway, because they believe that if they do not, the darkness will win. Part 4 of the Anneliese Michel case, 1976 in 1952, in the small Bavarian village of Liebelfing, Germany. A baby girl named Anneliese Michel was born into a deeply religious Catholic family. The Michels were traditional, quiet, and devoted to the church. Anneliese grew up surrounded by prayers, rituals, and a strict moral code. Her parents, Anna and Joseph Michel, believed firmly in the presence of God and the reality of the devil. They raised their daughters with an unshakable faith, and young Anneliese embraced this belief wholeheartedly. She was known as a sweet, gentle, and hardworking girl who attended Mass twice a week and regularly prayed the Rosary. As a child, Anneliese showed no signs of the horror that would one day engulf her life. She was a good student, soft-spoken, and eager to please her parents. But things began to change when she turned 16, in 1968. Without warning, Anneliese suffered her first seizure. She collapsed in class, her body stiffening and trembling uncontrollably. The doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that can cause seizures, hallucinations, and sudden changes in behavior. She was prescribed medication and sent home. At first, everyone assumed the medication would help, but the seizures continued. Anneliese's condition worsened over the next few years, despite trying different treatments. She began experiencing vivid hallucinations. She claimed to see disturbing faces, distorted and twisted, staring at her from the walls. At night, she heard voices whispering curses. She described feeling a presence in her room, something heavy and oppressive that pinned her down while she slept. Doctors dismissed these experiences as symptoms of epilepsy or depression, but Anneliese believed something far darker was happening. She became increasingly withdrawn. Her friends noticed she no longer laughed or smiled. Her weight dropped, and she often skipped meals, claiming the food tasted like rot. She prayed constantly, clinging to her faith for protection, but the voices only grew stronger. They mocked her prayers, calling her damned and unworthy. By 1973, Anneliese was a student at the University of Würzburg studying to become a teacher, but she was struggling. She avoided her classmates and often locked herself alone in her dorm room. She began to exhibit behaviors that alarmed even her closest friends. She would drop to her knees and pray compulsively for hours, sometimes until her legs gave out. She stopped attending lectures and stopped caring for her appearance. That same year, she told her family something chilling. She could no longer enter the church. When she tried to walk through the doors, an invisible force repelled her. She said she felt an unbearable heat and an intense hatred for the sacred objects inside. She described seeing demonic faces when she tried to pray, their mouths twisted in laughter. She told her mother she believed she was possessed. Anna and Joseph Michel were horrified. They were devout Catholics and believed strongly in the existence of demonic possession, but they also trusted the church's authority. They contacted their local parish priest and explained what was happening. The priest advised them to continue with medical treatment. The church was cautious about performing exorcisms, requiring clear evidence that the person's behavior could not be explained by mental illness. Anneliese continued to see doctors. She was prescribed stronger medications, including anti-seizure drugs and antidepressants. None of it helped. In fact, the voices in her head became even more vicious. They ordered her to hurt herself and her family. She bit herself and tore at her own skin. She stopped eating, claiming the demons forbade her. Her once bright, soft face became gaunt and hollow, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. By 1975, Annelise's condition had reached a breaking point. Her parents were desperate. They believed they were losing their daughter to something unholy. They returned to the church, begging for help. This time, the local priest, Father Ernst Alt, agreed that Annelise's case was unusual. He believed she showed signs of possession, an aversion to holy objects, supernatural strength, and knowledge of things she could not possibly know. Father Alt petitioned the Bishop of Würzburg, Joseph Stangl, for permission to perform an exorcism. After reviewing the case, Bishop Stangl granted approval under one condition: the ritual had to be performed in strict secrecy. He feared public scandal if the exorcism became known. He assigned Father Alt and another experienced priest, Father Arnold Renz, to carry out the rite according to the Ritual Romanum, the Church's official exorcism guidelines. The first session was held in September 1975. Anneliese was 23 years old. By then, she was frail and emaciated, weighing less than 90 pounds. Her parents had removed her from school, and she was living full-time at home. When the priests arrived, they found her pacing the house like a trapped animal. She growled and snapped at them, her voice low and guttural. Her eyes darted around the room as if she was watching something no one else could see. The exorcisms were grueling. Each session could last up to 4 hours. Father Alt and Father Renz would begin by reading prayers in Latin, calling on the name of Christ to banish the demons. Anneliese's body would convulse violently. She would scream, bark like a dog, and hiss at the priests. At times, her voice changed completely, becoming deep and masculine. The priests believed multiple entities were inside her. The voices identified themselves during the sessions. They claimed to be Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Cain, and even Adolf Hitler. One voice mocked the priests, saying, "You fools, she belongs to us." The priests pressed on, sprinkling holy water and holding up crucifixes. The demons would howl in rage when the sacred objects came near. Anneliese's family documented these sessions on audio tape. The recordings are some of the most disturbing evidence of alleged possession ever captured. In them, Anneliese's voice is unrecognizable. She growls, shrieks, and speaks in multiple tones at once, as though more than one voice is coming from her throat. She curses the priests and the church, at times laughing manically before collapsing into sobs. Over the course of 10 months, Anneliese underwent 67 exorcism sessions. She refused to eat, believing the demons would not allow it. She crawled under tables and licked the floor like an animal. She chewed on insects and even bit the head off a dead bird. Her parents tried to care for her, but they were overwhelmed. They were convinced that the exorcisms were her only hope, and so they allowed the priests to continue. Anneliese's health deteriorated rapidly. She was covered in bruises and sores. Her knees were swollen and bleeding from kneeling in prayer for hours on end. She was too weak to walk unassisted, yet during the exorcisms, she sometimes displayed bursts of unnatural strength, throwing the priests off her even though they outweighed her. On July 1, 1976, Anneliese Michel died in her home. She was 23 years old. Her official cause of death was malnutrition and dehydration. She weighed only 68 pounds at the time of her death. The autopsy revealed that her body was severely weakened, with broken knees and signs of prolonged neglect. Her death shocked Germany and quickly became a national scandal. Authorities charged her parents and the 2 priests with negligent homicide, arguing that they had allowed her to starve while focusing on exorcism instead of medical treatment. The trial began in 1978 and drew international attention. The prosecution painted a picture of religious fanaticism gone too far, While the defense argued that the family truly believed Anneliese was possessed and had acted out of love. The trial was heartbreaking. The court played the audio recordings from the exorcisms, forcing the jury to listen to the terrifying voices that had spoken through Anneliese. Her parents wept as they described watching their daughter waste away, believing they were doing what was best for her soul. The court ultimately convicted the priests and the Michels of manslaughter and gave them suspended sentences. The case sparked a bitter debate in Germany about the role of the church, the reality of possession, and the line between faith and neglect. To this day, Anneliese Michel's story remains one of the most infamous exorcism cases in history. Some believe she was a deeply troubled young woman who suffered from epilepsy and psychosis, her symptoms misinterpreted through the lens of religious belief. Others believe she was truly possessed, pointing to the recordings and her inexplicable behaviors as proof. What is certain is that Anneliese's final months were filled with unimaginable suffering. She died believing she was fighting for her soul. Whether her battle was against demons or her own mind, it left a scar on everyone who knew her. Her grave in Klingenberg am Main has become a site of pilgrimage for those who believe in her story, a reminder of how thin the line between faith and fear can be. Even now, decades later, priests and laypeople alike discuss the case in hushed tones. It is a warning, a mystery, and for some, evidence that the darkness the Church speaks of is real. Part 5. Other famous cases and the science versus supernatural debate. In the decades following the tragic death of Anneliese Michel, the world continued to grapple with the haunting question of whether cases of possession were manifestations of mental illness, misunderstood neurological conditions, or undeniable evidence of the supernatural. Throughout history, countless stories of exorcisms have emerged. But in modern times, a few cases stand out, each leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and dividing public opinion between science and faith. One of the most widely publicized cases after Anneliese S. was the 1974 possession of a young boy known by the pseudonym David in Connecticut, United States. This case gained notoriety not just because of the disturbing events that unfolded, but because it later became linked to a sensational murder trial. According to David's family, the boy began exhibiting strange behavior after visiting a rental property that was believed to be haunted. He experienced violent night terrors, woke up screaming about shadowy figures, and began speaking in strange, guttural voices that no child should be able to produce. His family sought the help of priests, but the situation worsened. Objects reportedly moved on their own in the house, doors slammed shut, and David would convulse as though being attacked by something invisible. When local priests were unable to provide relief, the family contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous demonologists known for their involvement in the Amityville case. The Warrens claimed that David was possessed by multiple entities and documented their findings with audio tapes and photographs. They sought the Catholic Church's approval for an exorcism, which was eventually granted. During the ritual, witnesses claimed to hear voices that were not David S. and saw his body contort in ways that seemed physically impossible. The Warrens later testified that the possession was unlike anything they had ever encountered. This case took a shocking turn when a family friend, Arne Johnson, became involved. He had challenged the demons during David's exorcism, daring them to take him instead. Shortly afterward, Arne began exhibiting erratic behavior. He claimed he was being stalked by a demonic presence. Weeks later, Arne murdered his landlord in a violent rage, stabbing him repeatedly. At his trial, Arne's lawyers presented a startling defense. He was possessed by demons at the time of the killing. This was the first time in U.S. history that demonic possession was used as a defense in a murder case. The court, however, rejected the argument, and Arne was convicted of manslaughter. This case reignited debate around possession and exorcism in America. Was it possible that the supernatural could influence human behavior to the point of homicide? Or were these individuals suffering from undiagnosed psychiatric conditions? While the Warrens and the family insisted the events were real, skeptics argued that David's symptoms could be explained by mental illness and that Arne's actions were the result of personal choice, not demonic influence. Across the Atlantic, another chilling case unfolded in 1998 in South Africa. A young girl named Clara Germana Seal, a devout Christian, suddenly began exhibiting disturbing behavior. She reportedly displayed knowledge of languages she had never studied, including Latin and French. She became inexplicably strong, lashing out at those around her, and her voice would deepen into a growl as she threatened to kill those attempting to help her. Witnesses claimed she could levitate several feet off the ground during her outbursts, a phenomenon that terrified even the priests. Clara's exorcism was a harrowing affair. 2 nuns and several priests worked tirelessly over 2 days, holding her down as they recited prayers. According to accounts, the demons screamed through Clara, mocking the priests and cursing God. At one point, she reportedly shredded a Bible with her bare hands. After hours of relentless prayer, Clara collapsed into unconsciousness, and the priests declared the exorcism successful. However, the emotional and physical toll it took on those present left a lasting mark. This case, like so many others, was met with skepticism. Psychologists argued that extreme cases of dissociative identity disorder or other psychiatric conditions could explain her behavior. Believers, however, maintained that the evidence, the levitation, the unexplainable language skills, and the superhuman strength pointed to something beyond science's reach. Even in recent years, reports of possession continue to emerge, including the case of a woman named Latoya Ammons in Gary, Indiana, in 2012. Latoya and her 3 children claimed to be terrorized by an invisible force in their home. They heard footsteps in empty rooms, saw shadowy figures, and experienced bizarre physical phenomena. One of Latoya's sons was said to have walked backward up a wall in front of witnesses, including a social worker and a nurse. The church eventually authorized an exorcism, performed by Father Michael Magina, who stated that the ritual was one of the most challenging he had ever conducted. Cases like Latoya's gained media attention in part because they included credible witnesses who had no religious agenda, such as doctors and law enforcement officials. These witnesses testified to experiencing things they could not explain, from strange electrical disturbances to seeing objects move on their own. While these cases captivated the public, they also fueled the larger debate between science and the supernatural. Neurologists and psychiatrists argue that possession symptoms often mirror those of epilepsy, schizophrenia, or dissociative disorders. Auditory and visual hallucinations, violent outbursts, and changes in voice or personality can all be explained by medical conditions. Some researchers believe cultural and religious beliefs can amplify these symptoms, convincing the afflicted that they are possessed, which in turn intensifies their behavior. However, exorcists and those who have witnessed the rituals firsthand insist that not everything can be explained away by science. They point to instances where the possessed display knowledge they could not possibly have, speak unknown languages, or exhibit physical abilities beyond human capability. They argue that while mental illness is real, there are cases where something darker is at work. This divide between science and faith has only deepened in recent years. The Catholic Church, for its part, has tried to walk a careful line. It now requires that extensive psychological and medical evaluations be conducted before an exorcism is approved. Priests are trained to distinguish between mental illness and true possession, but even they admit the line can be blurry. One priest who has performed dozens of exorcisms described the experience as entering a battlefield. "You can feel it," he said. The air changes. There's a weight in the room, and the person in front of you is no longer the same person you knew. You see hatred in their eyes that isn't theirs. You hear voices that don't belong to them. And you know you are confronting something evil. Skeptics counter that such descriptions rely heavily on subjective experience and religious bias. They point out that exorcisms can be dangerous, leading to death in some cases, as with Annalise Michel. They argue that vulnerable people can be manipulated by exorcists into believing they are possessed, worsening their suffering. Yet despite these criticisms, the demand for exorcisms has increased worldwide. In countries like Italy and the Philippines, priests report being overwhelmed with requests. The Vatican has even hosted training sessions for new exorcists, acknowledging that the faithful continue to seek help in fighting what they perceive as evil forces. This enduring belief in possession speaks to something deep within the human psyche. Perhaps it reflects our fear of losing control, of being overtaken by something we cannot see or understand. Or perhaps, as some exorcists insist, it is evidence of a spiritual battle that has raged since the beginning of time. For those who have lived through it, the question of whether possession is real is no longer abstract. Families who have watched loved ones change before their eyes, priests who have risked their lives in the ritual, and even doctors who have witnessed inexplicable events all struggle to explain what they have seen. The debate between science and the supernatural will likely never be resolved. Each side brings compelling arguments, yet neither can fully disprove the other. As long as stories of possession continue to surface from remote villages to modern cities, people will continue to wonder if there is a darkness out there that no medication or therapy can touch. And in quiet rooms behind closed doors, the rituals will continue. Priests will hold up their crucifixes, shamans will chant to their ancestors, and families will pray desperately for deliverance. Whether these acts are confronting demons or merely giving hope to the afflicted, they offer a lifeline to those who believe that something beyond this world has entered their lives and will not let go. Part 6. The Modern World and the Exorcist Legacy. In the years that followed the infamous cases of possession and exorcism, the world continued to evolve. Yet the shadow of these events lingered quietly in the corners of churches, homes, and human memory. The modern world, with its rapid advancements in technology, medicine, and science, appeared on the surface to leave little room for the ancient rituals of exorcism. Yet behind closed doors, in the hushed halls of churches and in the quiet prayers of families who believed they were under attack, the practice never disappeared. Instead, it adapted and endured, leaving a legacy as powerful and haunting as ever. The release of the book and film The Exorcist in the 1970s had been a cultural turning point. The story, inspired by real-life events, sent shockwaves through society, searing the image of possession and exorcism into the public consciousness. People who had once dismissed the concept as medieval superstition began to question whether there was more to these accounts than myth. The Church, initially wary of how the film sensationalized its sacred rite, could not deny the impact it had. Priests began receiving more requests for exorcisms than ever before. Families wrote desperate letters pleading for help, describing strange noises in their homes, mysterious illnesses, and loved ones who had suddenly changed into unrecognizable versions of themselves. As time passed, the Vatican recognized that the demand for exorcisms was growing, not shrinking, despite the modern world's growing reliance on science and psychology. In 1999, the Catholic Church officially revised the Ritual Romanum, the centuries-old manual for conducting exorcisms. The updated guidelines stressed the importance of ruling out all medical and psychiatric explanations before proceeding. Priests were encouraged to work with doctors, psychiatrists, and psychologists. Yet, once all natural causes had been eliminated, the Church stood firm. There were cases, it believed, where something dark and inhuman had taken hold. Behind the heavy wooden doors of training halls and seminaries, the church began to quietly train a new generation of exorcists. These priests learned how to recognize signs of possession aversion to holy objects, knowledge of languages never studied, unnatural strength, violent outbursts, and inexplicable phenomena. They were taught how to stay calm in the face of terror, how to continue praying even when a possessed person would scream in hatred and mockery. They practiced using the ancient prayers, the sprinkling of holy water, the laying on of hands. Many priests described these experiences as spiritual battles, moments when the veil between good and evil felt paper thin. One experienced exorcist in Rome described entering a small, dark room where a young woman sat bound to a chair, shaking violently. As he began to pray in Latin, her voice changed, dropping into a guttural growl. She hurled insults at him in perfect Italian, though she had only ever spoken her native dialect. Objects began to rattle on the shelves, and a crucifix on the wall fell with a loud crash. The priest did not flinch. He continued, his voice steady, invoking the name of Christ. Hours later, the woman collapsed, limp and silent. When she awoke, she wept quietly, not remembering the details of what had happened, only that she felt lighter, as though a shadow had been lifted. Cases like this were never publicized. The church preferred discretion, believing that publicizing exorcisms would invite ridicule or, worse, hysteria. But even as secrecy surrounded these rituals, reports of possession and exorcism trickled into the media from around the world. In countries like the Philippines, Poland, and Italy, priests reported being overwhelmed with requests. One Italian priest admitted that he was performing as many as 10 exorcisms a day. In the United States, the number of trained exorcists quietly increased as bishops recognized the growing demand. The modern church found itself in a delicate position. On one hand, it had to uphold its ancient teachings that evil was real, that demonic forces could influence the world, and that exorcism was a powerful weapon against them. On the other hand, it could not ignore the findings of modern medicine and psychology. Many people who believed they were possessed were actually suffering from mental illness, trauma, or neurological disorders. The church, therefore, emphasized that exorcism should be the last resort, not the first. This approach required exorcists to exercise extraordinary discernment. One priest described meeting a man who claimed to be possessed, only to discover that he was suffering from untreated schizophrenia. Another recalled a woman who believed a demon was attacking her at night, but further investigation revealed she had been a victim of abuse and was experiencing severe PTSD. These cases reminded exorcists that they were not merely spiritual warriors, but also compassionate shepherds who needed to guide people toward healing, whether through prayer or professional medical care. Yet even with this careful approach, there were cases that defied explanation. Priests told of individuals who recoiled violently at the sight of a crucifix but could not explain why. Of voices that emerged from within them speaking languages they had never studied, of physical phenomena that left even the most skeptical observers shaken. One priest described seeing a chair slide across a room on its own during a ritual, the sound of its legs scraping the floor echoing like a warning. Another recalled the temperature in a room dropping so suddenly and drastically that everyone could see their breath as they prayed. In the modern world, where so much can be explained by science, these moments stood out sharply. For the exorcists, they were reminders that the battle they fought was not symbolic but real. They believed that evil had adapted, becoming more subtle, hiding behind addictions, destructive behaviors, and ideologies that pulled people away from God. The exorcism ritual was not simply about casting out demons from individuals, but about restoring a sense of hope and faith in a world that often felt consumed by darkness. The legacy of The Exorcist lived on, not just in the church but in popular culture. The film had left an indelible mark, inspiring countless movies, books, and television shows about possession. Some were meant to terrify, others to mock, but all kept the concept alive in the collective imagination. For priests who performed the ritual, this could be a double-edged sword. The dramatization of exorcisms often led people to expect spinning heads and levitation, when in reality most sessions were quiet, prayerful, and uneventful. But the popularity of these stories also meant that more people knew where to turn when they believed they were under spiritual attack. Modern exorcists often worked in near anonymity, knowing that their work would be misunderstood or ridiculed if made public. They carried a heavy burden, spending long hours listening to people describe their deepest fears and darkest experiences. Many spoke of how exhausting it could be, how the weight of the suffering they witnessed sometimes followed them home. But they also spoke of the profound joy they felt when someone was freed from what they believed was a demonic presence. In the quiet corners of churches around the world, these rituals continued. They were not dramatic spectacles for an audience, but private, sacred acts meant to bring healing. Priests, doctors, and families worked together, each hoping to find the source of the suffering and bring peace to the afflicted. Some cases ended with medical treatment or therapy, others with whispered prayers in candlelit rooms. The modern world, with all its technological wonders, had not erased the mysteries of the human soul. Questions about good and evil, about forces beyond what we can see, still haunted people. Whether one believed in possession or not, the stories endured. They reminded humanity of the fragility of life, of the unseen battles that might rage within us, and of the enduring hope that light could overcome even the darkest shadow. The legacy of the Exorcist, both the ritual and the cultural figure it had become, was not one of fear alone, but of resilience. It was a testament to humanity's desire to confront the unknown, to stand firm in the face of what it could not fully understand. And so, in the modern world, in cities and villages, in homes and churches, the exorcist's work went on quietly, but resolutely, a thread connecting the past to the present, the ancient to the contemporary, and the spiritual to the human. This was the real case that inspired the book and the film The Exorcist, but this is just one story. Hundreds of similar exorcisms have been reported around the world, many far darker than Roland Doe's case. In the next part, we will uncover the secrets of the Vatican's real exorcists, and how the Church continues to battle what it calls pure evil. If you want to see the full story unfold, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now and turn on the bell icon, because the next part will take you even deeper into the darkness. Do you dare to watch, or will you turn away? Comment below. I'd dare to watch if you're brave enough to continue this journey.